summer 2007, and Britain was hit by some of the worst flooding in recorded history in this country. Now, torrential rain caused water tables to rise suddenly, and low-lying parts of the west of England, such as here in Tewkesbury, were particularly badly hit. So here I am now, standing next to the river at Tewkesbury. Now, its level rose so quickly that it burst its banks and forced 1,800 households into temporary accommodation. So while a majority of people returned home fairly fast, more than 200 were still living in temporary accommodation a year later. Now, 70 of them were put up in caravans. 18 months on, and 6 households continue to live in those caravans. So we are here in Tewkesbury to find out what life is like 5 years on, and ask, if this were to happen again now, would insurance pay for rebuild and restoration?
And we had people who were flooded out and lost all their all their wares, really, all their
Just tell me about some of the people you know who had that happen to them.
Well, it was through work, so I can't really say very much. But they certainly had. They were moved around the county, really, out of Tewkesbury.
Well, I worked with a lady that lived up near the school, going towards the motorway. And she lived in a caravan outside her house for nearly 2 years, and in the end, her husband didn't survive it.
Oh.
Well, initially, as you can imagine, people are very concerned and confused after a flooding event. You get this terrible swathe of floodwater coming into your property. Unfortunately, it brings mud and dirt with it, I'm afraid, as well. And so there's an element of not knowing what to do, and that's where our industry really comes in. In the few hours after the flooding, our emergency teams came into Tewkesbury and started helping shop owners and business owners, and also residential homes.
So what sort of technology would they have brought in? We'll be seeing this later.
Yes, well, the first thing, and in some ways most obvious, is they come in with water extraction equipment, pumps and wet vacuuming equipment to actually suck out as much of the water from a premises as possible and clean up the mud and silt to help with bacterial contamination. Once that initial phase is over and the building is in a more stable state, then we come in with different types of drying equipment, different types of dehumidifiers, which, as you say, we'll have a look at later on, to help bring buildings back to a moisture level which is appropriate following a flooding event.
There was a lot of damage happened straight after that flooding. What about the damage that sort of happens after the actual flood itself? Does that happen?
It can do. That's what we refer to as secondary damage. The primary damage is, of course, the flood itself, and unfortunately there's nothing we can do to have stopped that. But in the hours and days after a flood, when a building is very, very wet, you can suffer from secondary damage, and that would be things like fabrics or books and things starting to go mouldy. Even building materials, plaster for example, can exhibit mould growth very quickly after a flooding event.
And also, I suppose, with any building, it's the smell that you've got to get rid of, isn't it? That smell can go on if it's not treated properly. That's
right, and what you're smelling there is effectively the products from the floodwater being broken down by the bacteria that the floodwater has brought in. So our industry pays a lot of close attention to what we call multi-cleaning, where we'll actually clean through let's say it's a shop premises, for example, carry out testing to see what bacterial contamination is left, and if there is still contamination, then obviously cleaning again with disinfectant to ensure that bacterial contamination is resolved. Once you've got rid of that and got bacteria levels down to a normal level, what you'd expect in a premises, then that smell should abate.
Also, many people had to move out of their homes, and some were left living in temporary accommodation, even caravans, for a year plus after that. What sort of things would have been going on with those sort of properties a year afterwards? Right.
Well, in some respects that's a great shame, of course, if people have to move out of their properties and be out for that length of time. What normally is happening is there can be a delay between the drying works firstly being completed, and then obviously reinstatement contractors, builders coming in to reinstate plasterboard walls, for example. What our industry has really been trying to focus on is preventing that long delay by ensuring that the drying techniques we use, things like envelope drying, injection drying, prevent the need for so much strip out of properties, and therefore prevent the need for so much reinstatement. And really that's helping to reduce claim times overall.
And what sort of things have we learnt about dealing with these big floods, these flooding occasions, since that time 5 years ago?
Well, there's been a lot of development in the industry. We've been working towards new educational standards, making sure that contractors involved in fire and flood restoration work really are at the top of their game.